Hello everyone, welcome to class 4 session. Yesterday we were discussing shared object repository. So we were supposed to discuss all these topics and yesterday the first topic got completed. Okay, so what was left out is the the descriptive programming. In that, first one is static descriptive programming and dynamic descriptive programming. So what exactly the descriptive programming is all about? All these days, it's like if at all I open a test, let me open a test which we had developed earlier. Say the LOR test if I open it, right? We had the code written here. Okay. This sentence, say assume the line number 7, if it needs to get executed, what it actually does, it tries to learn the object properties from the object repository. If you see here, say first one is sign in, right? If you see here, see browser page and sign in link. What is the properties for sign in link? It is something like this: text, sign in, and HTML tag is yeah. Basically, with this properties, it is able to identify the link. Okay, so let me just highlight and show that. If you see here, based on these properties, QTP is able to identify the link object. Okay, now let me just close this. Okay, assume how exactly the web edit is identified. Now you should be in a better position to say how exactly it is identified. If you see here object repository, where is my web edit now? It is in this page. Log ID. What are the properties which is able to identify, the QTP able to identify? When I say properties, right, as we discussed earlier, say assume if I want to identify a person, okay, first thing it should be the unique name or unique ID. Okay, if at all I want to identify a person, first thing is I need to look into his passport number because that will be a unique number, or the PAN card number, or your employee ID. Okay, that way, the same way, the QTP also identifies the object with those properties. If you see here, for a web edit, type is text, name is log ID, and HTML tag is input. Okay, so for password, how exactly it is identifying? The same way, but if you see here, type is password, name is PSWD, HTML tag is input. So when we identify a person, first we check with something called as mandatory properties, guys. Mandatory properties are, to identify a person, it would be like your passport number or your PAN card number or your employee ID, anything. Okay, so those are kind of unique identifier that we can call that as a term that as a mandatory properties. Same way, in QTP also there are set of mandatory properties. Those mandatory properties are, okay, please see the screen, guys. What I'll do is I'll click on a new test, open a new test. First, before getting into the descriptive programming, right, we need to be familiar with what exactly these properties are. Okay, first property, how the QTP identify is, it's with respect to mandatory properties. Mandatory properties. In mandatory properties, okay, what are the mandatory properties it identifies? To identify an object. Okay, first and foremost is title. Okay, second one is name. We are just terming this. Nobody has defined that these are the mandatory properties, but the user terms these properties as mandatory properties. Then the other important property is HTML tag. Okay, and the most important property which we will be using in our framework and all those things as a mandatory property is HWND, that is called as a browser handle. Okay, so title, name, HTML tag, HWND. There's another important one called as HTML ID. So when you try to write a programming things with respect to these properties, right, QTP can easily identify the object. All these things were carried out. We were not worried when we were using object repository. Okay, when we were not worried when we were using the object repository. As of now, not to worry. I'll explain you clearly how exactly it gets differentiated from the object repository and the descriptive programming. Okay, just a heads up kind of a thing. When I get in depth, when I take the session for object identification, right, we'll get in depth. As of now, this kind of a heads up. Okay, these are the mandatory properties. There are something called as assistive properties. Assistive properties are nothing but it is inner text. You'll be wondering what exactly this property is, why this guy is talking about the properties and all those stuff. Okay, these properties are required to write the code now, to automate the things using the descriptive programming. So that's why we are introducing this now. Okay, assistive properties are inner text, outer text, inner HTML, outer HTML. Okay, so this is the assistive properties. And what is this assistive properties? How can I correlate with my real world examples? The real world example, as I said, the mandatory is what you call the PAN card number, passport number, and all those things, right? Assistive properties are like, okay, you can correlate that to a person. Okay, this person is 6 feet height. He is weighing around 75 kgs. All those things are assistive properties. Okay, so that way it is supporting to the earlier properties. Okay, then QTP identifies an object with something called as ordinal identifier. It identifies through something called as ordinal identifier. How QTP identifies the object is, first it checks for the mandatory properties whether everything is there or not. Okay, and then it checks for the assistive properties. If it is not able to identify the object with the mandatory properties, then it takes the help of the assistive properties. If the QTP is not able to identify the object with assistive properties, right, then it goes to ordinal identifier. Ordinal identifier is very important, guys. Okay, it is like ordinal identifier. We have three things. One is index, location, and creation time. We'll be getting in depth later, as I said, when we do the object identification examples, basically the concepts. Okay, the last thing, if first assume if QTP is not able to identify the object, assume it is trying to click on the link sign in itself. It tries to identify the object with the mandatory property. Assume it's not happening. Okay, so then it takes the help of the assistive properties. With these two things also it's not able to identify, then it goes to ordinal identifier. Okay, if all the three things gets failed, that is mandatory, assistive, and ordinal identifier, last thing it would take help of is smart identification. Sorry guys, smart identification. Okay, in smart identification there is something called as base filter property. All these are what you call the certification question, guys. Base filter properties and optional filter properties. You'll be wondering what is this guy is talking about completely. Today is like totally out of sync, whatever we were doing earlier. Okay, these are the set of things which is required as a prerequisite before we start writing the descriptive programming. That's why it's given as a heads up, guys. Okay, now let me repeat. First and foremost, how QTP identifies the object is It tries to identify with the mandatory properties. Okay. To be precise, what I'll do is I'll try to show with one of the example. When it is with an example, we'll try to understand what exactly I am talking about. Okay, let me open the application. Let me open an application. To write the descriptive programming, right, we need to use something called as object spy. Okay, I'll let you know what exactly the main difference is. Okay, click on the object spy. What object spy will do is it will learn the properties. Okay, click on this hand symbol. Assume I need to work on this web edit. I need to work on this web edit. If you see here in web edit, okay, what are the mandatory properties? Okay, let me come to the browser. Okay, what are the mandatory properties which we have here? What we termed it here? The mandatory property is the title. What is the title? This is the property and this is the property value. General EMI calculator. So any other mandatory property which we can see? The name. The name is also same thing. So do we see something else, HTML tag and HTML ID? In this, it is not available. Okay, if you see here, what are the properties available, right? You need to take that and use it in descriptive programming. I'll let you know how exactly to do it. See, to identify the browser, these are the set of properties. If you see here, at least 10 to 12 properties will be there. Closely to 15 properties will be there. That value is given here. And the last but not least is the HWND. What is that called as? It is called as browser handle, which is very important, guys. We will be using that in our framework design. If you see here, HWND is some value. Everybody got it? So if I come to a page, what is the mandatory property which we have? The title. Anything else? Do we have the name thing here? Name is blank. Okay, so do I have anything else? Nothing is there. Okay, whichever is having the availability, right, that properties we will be using. As we discussed yesterday, web table is optional. Okay, let me come to our standard object, web edit. Okay, what are the properties, the mandatory properties which we have here? HTML tag, input, and anything else which we can use, the name. All these are mandatory properties, guys. Okay, what exactly this assistive property is? Same way you can see inner text, outer text, inner HTML, outer HTML, and all those things with respect to each object. So assistive properties also will be displayed here. Okay, likewise all the properties and the property values are displayed. You need to use that to write the descriptive programming. Okay guys, let me repeat. To identify the object, basically QTP identifies the object through something called as mandatory properties, assistive properties, and third one is ordinal identifier, and fourth is smart identification. This ordinal identifier and smart identification we'll get in detail when we discuss object identification concept. Basically it would be on Tuesday, guys, to be precise. We'll be having the set of example for ordinal identifier and smart identification. Okay, so now let me just open the test. As I opened the test earlier, how exactly the QTP used to work? It used to work something like this. The code used to be available in this editor. If at all the code needs to be executed in the application, first it executes here. It takes the help of the object repository. It is always like a triangular way. First it learns, it executes here, it learns the object here, and then it interacts with the application. Basically in this case the application would be what? Books.rediff.com. This is how it used to be working. Okay, why I am reiterating is, it is like the descriptive programming will be little bit different, guys. Okay, but it is very easy, not to worry on that. Okay, first it executes this line of code, it learns the object here, and then it interacts with the application. Now it's kind of a triangular mode. If I minimize this, it was something like this. First execution, learn the object, then only it was acting on objects in the application. Now, with the descriptive programming, what happens is this object repository is eliminated. We won't store anything in the object repository. It's very important, guys. In descriptive programming, this object repository, right, is eliminated. Now, whatever the code we write, it should directly interact with the application. It should directly interact with what? The application. Do we need any object repository? No, not required. Then the question is, how exactly it comes to know? It is basically QTP will be able to identify the object when we give that property name and the property value. Descriptive programming will have its own syntax. Through that, it will be able to identify the objects. Okay, let me reiterate, guys. In the descriptive programming, we won't be having object repository. We will be directly interacting with the application. How exactly it is? We'll be giving property name and the property value by spy. Okay, let me start with an